Over the last 20 years, women in the U.S. have made big strides in the workplace. More women are working full-time, and there's greater representation in male-dominated industries like finance, engineering, and tech. However, even with these positives, there's still one big obstacle that hasn't changed all that much: the gender wage gap. Working women in the U.S. are still not paid the same as their male counterparts. In fact, according to a recent study published by Pew Research Center, the pay gap has barely improved since 2002.
In the last 2 decades, this century, there has been virtually no change in the gender wage gap. So today, the gender wage gap stands at women making about 82 cents to the dollar compared with men. And this is not much higher than at the turn of the century when it stood at 80 cents to the dollar. But back 40 years ago, the gender wage gap was 65 cents to the dollar. So there has been progress, but it has come to a stop in the last couple of decades.
That's Rakesh Kocher, a senior researcher at the Pew Research Center who authored this most recent study on the gender wage gap. Kocher notes that the gap steadily improved between 1960 and 1980 because more women started going to college. But today, there's actually more female college students than male students, and yet there's still a pay disparity. Another expert weighing in on the topic is Ariane Hagevish, a senior research fellow at the Institute for Women's Policy Research. She highlights that the wage gap begins immediately after college graduation.
You have a wage gap right out of the gate. So studies comparing, say, young women and young men who finished college in similar type of universities and in similar type of disciplines, and right out of the gate, there's a wage gap of about 5%.
If women start their careers making 95 cents to a man's dollar, then how does the gap over time widen to an average of 82 cents to each dollar? She says it's because many women today still end up handling the brunt of childcare and elder care.
The difficulties with getting affordable and reliable childcare, the difficulties with organizing elder care that allows people to stay at work or doesn't penalize them for being out of work when they come back, and the unequal sense of responsibility between women and men of who should be the primary caregiver for children or elderly people who may need support is a factor.
She adds that such responsibilities like childcare tend to take place during a person's 20s or 30s. This is when a lot of people tend to make big jumps in their careers. For the next 10 years after that, the data shows that women's pay relative to their male counterparts stagnates. According to Kocher's study, wages drop most sharply around ages 35 to 44. At the same time, men's salaries begin to accelerate. In his research, Kocher found that while pay decreases for women who become mothers, the opposite occurs for men who become fathers.
Another thing that happens with parenthood is that it's not just that women withdraw from the labor market a bit, but men actually engage more with the labor market. They increase the rate at which they participate in the labor force, they put in more hours, and their salaries actually tend to increase with parenthood. So there is that opposite mirror sort of effect that happens with men. We call that the fatherhood wage premium. Well, these are part of broader cultural and social norms. Who takes care of family? Who takes care of parents, not just children, and so on. Broader social and cultural norms that seem to impinge on men and women in different ways.
While the pay gap narrows again between 50 and 55, it's not enough to make up for several years of a widening gap. Hagevish notes that family care isn't the only factor feeding into the issue. Another big cause is what she calls occupational segregation.
Women and men tend to do different work. And in occupations that are primarily done by women, you get much lower returns on any investment in education. And that's particularly so say, in those occupations that do not need a university degree, but also if you think of teachers or social workers, they really have to invest much more in education and get much lower returns than, say, if you work as a finance manager or even as an engineer.
According to CNBC, the industries with the largest wage gaps are male-dominated fields like finance, insurance, and consultancy. On the flip side, the pay gap is smaller in female-led industries like real estate and education, for example. While change is happening in some circles, experts say it's not moving fast enough. So, how can working people make a difference? Both Kocher and Hegewisch agree that in order for change to happen, it's important that women, at all levels and in all industries, speak up more.
Firstly, we know from studies women tend to ask or negotiate less often than men, but we also know that when they do ask, they either don't have any results or they may get penalized for it by being almost stigmatized as somebody who's too pushy or, it's not appropriate behavior.
At the end of the day, there's greater power in numbers, and both men and women can speak up about pay equity. While some view this as a women's issue, it's also about gender equality, fair labor practices, and workers' rights. One way to foster change in the workplace is to have more discussions around salary. While it may seem taboo to discuss this with coworkers, this transparency allows for greater bargaining power when facing an employer. Hegewisch believes that workers should also support the growing practice of upfront pay transparency. In recent years, it's become more common for companies hiring on LinkedIn, Indeed, or another job site to post the salary range for a role they're hiring for. There are many factors that play into closing the gender pay gap, and these are just some starting points. Even though the current projections don't have the gap closing until 2059, there are policy changes that can speed up the process. One important piece is to press legislators on passing greater subsidies for child care and upping parental and family leave.
I think the big shifts in the wage gap will come if we have a proper investment in care infrastructure. So if it's no longer as penalizing to have children and to get childcare, and if we can find a way to deal with the issue of elder care, taking care of your family in a more effective way.
Ultimately, most women in America want to work and have successful, profitable careers. If this means giving up on having kids because there aren't enough societal structures in place to do both, then that's what may happen. Hegewisch points to Italy as an example, where recent data shows that births in the country have reached a new record low.
I think it's now less than one child per woman of childbearing age. And you can see that in countries where this became such a big factor, big social factor, that very many women just could not imagine how they could have a kid, then there suddenly was a big investment in childcare. So who knows what may push us into that direction, but I think it does then we will see change.
To find out more about this topic and our guests, Rakesh Kocher and Adrienne Hegewisch, visit viewpointsradio.org. To reach Kocher's study, The Enduring Grip of the Gender Pay Gap, visit pewresearch.org. For more behind the scenes, check out Viewpoints Radio on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. This segment was written and produced by Grace Galante. Our executive producer is Amira Zaveri. Our studio manager is Jason Dickey. I'm Gary Price. This segment is brought to you by the Capital One Venture X card. Earn 10x miles on hotels and rental cars and 5x miles on flights when you book through Capital One Travel, plus 2x miles on all other purchases. Capital One, what's in your wallet? Terms apply. See CapitalOne.com for details. Coming up on Viewpoints.
high caseloads, low pay, and just working conditions that aren't conducive to the overall wellness of social workers or any employee for that matter.
Social work burnout in the U.S. Then,
has a cave, has a glacier, has mountains, has 1,000-year-old trees.
Want to wander off the beaten path this summer? Consider road tripping by RV. I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows and find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.